In 53 BC, the Roman Republic was an unstoppable force. From the misty islands of Britannia to the ancient lands of Egypt, the shadow of the Roman eagle loomed over the known world. The era was defined by giants who wielded swords and wrote legends. Pompey, who conquered the East, and Caesar, who subdued Gaul. But there was a third name, a man who stood in their shadows, yearning for glory of his own. It was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Night, in his lavish study in Rome, Crassus stood alone in the oppressive silence. He was the richest man in Rome, a tycoon who could buy a city with gold, precious Persian carpets, exquisite Greek statues, expensive manuscripts. None of them could fill the emptiness in his soul. The flickering candlelight illuminated the colossal marble statues in the Great Hall, Alexander the Great, Pompey, and Caesar. The light only honored their deeds, while Crassus, the master of all this wealth, remained in darkness. He walked over and touched the inscription carved at the foot of Pompey's statue, Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, a title bestowed by military victories, not gold. A trusted advisor, a freed slave who had served him since his youth, quietly entered. "My lord," he said, his voice filled with concern, "you have it all. Unrivaled wealth, political power in the Senate. Why risk it all for a war in a faraway land, a war Rome does not need?" Crassus did not turn around. He pointed at the statues, his voice bitter. "They are carved from marble of their deeds. My statue, if there be one, will be cast from gold, and gold will melt. When I die, they will remember Pompey for his deeds, Caesar for his great conquests, and me. They will remember him as a real estate agent, a moneylender. I don't want to be remembered as such. I need a deed of my own." That was the real motive. Not mere greed for gold, but the fear of being forgotten, the obsession to stand alongside the greatest. Parthia, a wealthy empire in the East, would be the stage for his final performance. The door to the study opened. Publius, son of Crassus, a young man full of enthusiasm, entered. His eyes sparkled as he looked at his father. In his hand was a copy of the life of Alexander the Great. "Father," Publius said, "I have heard the Senate discuss it. They say you will lead the legion east, following Alexander's path. Is that true?" Crassus turned, his eyes softening as he looked at his son. He saw in Publius his own younger self, ambitious and thirsting for glory. "Yes, my son," he replied, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. "But we will go further than Alexander. Together we will make history. The name of the Crassus family will be engraved forever." Crassus's love and hope for his son became part of his own ambition. Little did he know that the glory he was seeking for his son would ultimately be the very thing that would destroy him. Meanwhile, in Parthia, thousands of miles from Rome, news of the Roman invasion reached the young General Shurna. He was not a nobleman by birth, but a self-made military genius. He was not sitting in a luxurious study. He was standing in the desert with his soldiers under the blazing sun. He used a branch to draw his strategy in the sand. He knew his enemy well. "The Romans are strong, disciplined," he told his commanders. "They are like a bull. Their strength lies in charging straight ahead. Never meet the bull head-on, for he will crush you. Let him exhaust himself in the desert, let him chase after ghosts. Then we will be wolves, picking at his flesh from all sides until he falls." Shurna's military philosophy was not to destroy, but to make the enemy self-destruct. His culture was one of adaptation, of patience, things that Crassus lacked. Finally, the day came when Crassus would appeal to the Senate. He faced fierce opposition. The magistrates warned that the war was unjust and would be cursed by the gods. The omens continued to appear, but Crassus had gone too far to turn back. This was the moment when he would pay his soul. He had used his vast wealth to bribe the senators and used empty promises to silence any opposition. He had ignored both the law and the will of heaven. As he and his legion stepped out of the gates of Rome, a magistrate stood there, performing an ancient curse, calling on the gods to punish Crassus for plunging Rome into an unjust war. But Crassus did not turn back. He had declared war, not just on Parthia, but on destiny itself. The road to glory or to ruin had begun. On the Syrian border, before the mighty Roman army entered Parthian territory, Crassus received two final warnings. The first came from a king. The Armenian king, Artaxerxes II, a wise ally, had come to the camp. He spread out a map, pointing to the treacherous mountain pass through Armenia. "My lord Crassus," he said, "do not go through the Mesopotamian desert. That is the home of the Parthians, their greatest ally. Go through my land. The mountains will neutralize their cavalry, and I will provide you with tens of thousands of skilled Armenian cavalry." It was a golden offer, a safe passage and a huge army of reinforcements. But for Crassus, accepting the offer meant sharing the glory, and he did not want to share. "I appreciate your kindness, my lord," Crassus replied arrogantly. "But the Roman legion will not detour. We will take the quickest route to victory." The second warning came from a soldier. An experienced Roman centurion who had fought in the East for many years also expressed his concern. "Sir, fighting nomadic cavalry in the desert is a nightmare. We will be exhausted before we even see the enemy." Crassus brushed it all aside. Roman discipline will conquer all. His arrogance sealed his fate. He had rejected both the wisdom of a king and the experience of a soldier. The march began. Over 40,000 Roman soldiers, one of the largest armies ever assembled, marched into the Mesopotamian desert. Immediately, they faced a new enemy, one more invisible and ruthless than the Parthians: the desert. The searing heat beat down on the metal armor, turning it into a walking furnace. Sandstorms suddenly arose, stinging the eyes and obscuring vision. Drinking water ran out. The soldiers, accustomed to the temperate climate of Europe, began to tire. They marched in an endless sea of sand. Their spirits, initially high, were slowly being sapped by the desert. Before they met a single Parthian soldier, they began to lose. And then they appeared, not as an army but as ghosts on the horizon. The first Parthian cavalry. They rode up, fired a few arrows, and then disappeared into the dust, quick as the wind. They did not fight, they harassed, provoked, like wolves playing with a lost bull. Crassus began to feel uneasy. The fear of flanking, the classic weakness of infantry armies, haunted him. Against an enemy he did not understand, Crassus made an unconventional order, a decision that would seal the fate of his army. He ordered the legions to adopt the most defensive formation, the hollow square. The seasoned officers hesitated. Such a formation was too slow, too passive. But the order was given. Tens of thousands of soldiers began to move, forming a giant square. In fear of flanking, Crassus had locked his army in a mobile prison. He had gained safety, but he had sacrificed mobility. In the desert, against a cavalry unit, that was a death sentence. As soon as the square was established, the ground began to shake. From the front, thousands of Parthian cataphracts heavy cavalry appeared. The Romans tightened their formation, preparing for a devastating charge. But the charge never came. The cataphract cavalry only charged closer and then suddenly split to the sides. It was just a feint. And then from all directions, thousands of Parthian light cavalry rushed out, surrounding the Roman square. A storm of arrows began. Thousands and tens of thousands of arrows were fired at the trapped Roman army. The sound of battle was not the sound of swords, but the horrible whistling of arrows, the thud, thud, thud as they pierced wooden shields, piercing armor and flesh. The Roman soldiers could only raise their shields to shield themselves, helplessly enduring the rain of death. The centurion who had warned Crassus, now covered in wounds, tried to reach the commander. "Sir, he shouted over the whistling of arrows. "This is not a battle, this is a massacre. We cannot advance, we cannot retreat. Please give the order to retreat to Carrhae before it is too late." Crassus looked at the chaos. He saw his men falling like chaff. In a moment he realized he had been wrong. Artavas's warnings, the centurions, all echoed in his head. But to retreat now. To retreat would mean admitting defeat, returning to Rome in disgrace, becoming a laughingstock to Pompey and Caesar. Blinded by ambition and pride, he clung to one last hope. "Hold the line," he shouted back. "They will soon run out of arrows." It was no longer arrogance, but tragic stubbornness. In the midst of the arrow storm, Crassus saw a young soldier who was seriously wounded. He rushed forward, shielded the soldier with his shield, and bandaged his wound himself. For a brief moment, he was not a greedy general, but a leader who cared about his men. But that moment of humanity was too small and too late. After a fierce barrage of arrows, there was a brief lull. A Roman officer shouted in hope, "They're out of arrows. We've won." A glimmer of hope flickered across the line. But then Crassus, through the dust, looked toward the Parthians. He froze. He saw a sight that completely shattered his last hope. The camels, Shorna's secret weapon, were advancing, carrying thousands of spare arrows to resupply the archers right on the battlefield. The arrow storm began again, even more fierce than before. Crassus's expression changed from hope to utter despair. He had planned for a battle of endurance where his men would wear down the enemy. He never imagined that he would face a battle of logistics. Hope was dead. Only carnage awaited. Hope was dead. Only carnage awaited. Inside the Roman square, order had begun to break down. The screams of the wounded mingled with the whistling of never-ending arrows. For the legionaries, this was no longer a battle. It was torture, a slow execution under the scorching sun. Crassus, in his desperation, searched for a miracle, a way out. And then he saw it. Or rather, he thought he saw it. A large group of Parthian cavalry in the distance seemed to be retreating, perhaps to regroup. It was a gap, a slim chance. The pride of a Roman general would not allow him to stand idly by and take the blows. He turned to his son, Publius, a brave young commander, still burning with fighting spirit. "Son," Crassus shouted, his voice hoarse, "this is your chance, our chance. Lead the Gallic cavalry and all your cavalry and pursue them. Chase them away and make a path for us to retreat." Publius, eager to make a name for himself, eager to prove his mettle, did not hesitate. "For Rome, for Crassus," he shouted, then led his mighty cavalry charging out of the square like an arrow. Crassus watched with a fatherly look of hope and pride, a glimmer of light in the darkness of despair. Little did he know, this was a false retreat, a classic psychological trap of nomadic peoples. Shorna had used Crassus's love and hope for his son as bait. Publius's pursuit was initially successful. The Parthian cavalry continued to retreat, seemingly in panic. But then Publius noticed something strange. The sand beneath his horse's hooves was sinking deeper and deeper. The cavalry's pace slowed. And then the retreating Parthian army suddenly stopped. From both flanks from behind, thousands of heavy cavalry, cataphracts, living tanks, suddenly appeared, forming an iron encirclement. The trap was closed. Publius and his army were swallowed by the desert. They fought bravely to the last man, and Publius, to avoid being taken prisoner, committed suicide. Back on the main battlefield, the Parthians returned. But this time, their drums were beating celebratory, terrifying sounds. A single cataphract horseman advanced on the Romans. He was unarmed. He held a spear high. At the tip of that spear was the thing that had shattered Crassus's soul, the severed head of Publius. The entire Roman legion fell silent. The whistling of arrows seemed to have stopped. All eyes turned to the horrific scene and then to Crassus. The camera zoomed in on his face from shock to disbelief to utter collapse. He did not scream. And in the dead silence, Crassus was heard to utter a single sentence, not as a general but as a devastated father. "My son, have I traded false glory for your life?" The battle was over for Crassus. This was no longer a Roman war. It had become the personal tragedy of a father who had lost his son. His lust for glory had been paid for with his own blood. Night fell. Crassus sat motionless in his tent, utterly devastated, his face expressionless. He could no longer give orders. His officers, Cassius and Octavius, were forced to take command. They knew that staying here meant death. They decided to retreat during the night to the nearby city of Carrhae. But in order to move quickly, they issued the most cruel and shameful order in the history of Roman warfare: abandon all 4,000 wounded. The retreat began in silence, but that silence was quickly broken by the screams of those left behind. They begged, they cursed, they called out the names of their comrades who had abandoned them. It was the sound of betrayal, the cry of the legendary Roman discipline crumbling. The next morning, the Parthians passed through and massacred all the wounded. The retreat was also a disaster. Pursued relentlessly by the Parthians, the last remnants of the Roman army were eventually surrounded. Shorna, in a sarcastic diplomatic move, proposed peace negotiations. Crassus did not want to go, but his remaining soldiers, no longer trusting the commander who had driven them to their deaths, mutinied and forced him to leave. During the negotiations, a fight broke out, probably staged in advance. Crassus was killed. The final act of the tragedy took place not on the battlefield but at a Parthian feast. They laid down Crassus's head. They melted down the Roman gold coins they had plundered, and then they poured the molten gold down the head's throat. It is said that the Parthians did this to mock Crassus's insatiable thirst for gold and glory, the thirst that had started the war, and in the end, it would literally consume him. 20,000 Romans were killed, 10,000 were taken prisoner and exiled to the far reaches of the Parthian Empire. The Battle of Carrhae became one of the most disastrous defeats, a scar that would never heal in Roman history. It marked a line that the mighty empire could never cross, and left an immortal lesson in the price of greed. The thirst for gold had started the war, and in the end, it was gold that became his tombstone. So, one man's thirst for gold wrote one of the most tragic chapters in Roman history. But the story of Marcus Crassus is more than a lesson in greed. It is a mirror of the most enduring human fear, the fear of being forgotten. Are we willing to pay such a high price just to be remembered? Is our legacy truly built on gold and silver and deeds, or on the simple things we leave behind in the hearts of our loved ones? This is more than a movie. This is a wake-up call.